One thing that every human being has in common is the desire to be happy. Now, the things that make us happy and how we pursue happiness varies from person to person, but we all share a common desire for happiness. I remember the first time after becoming a pastor, my wife and I went out of town for a week on vacation. When we came back, one of the most mature leading families in the church was going through a divorce. And so I sat down with a couple to try to figure out what was going on because it kind of came out of nowhere. There was no abuse, there was no unfaithfulness, there was no significant event that caused this sudden change. Just things had gotten hard and they weren't feeling it anymore. And it wasn't making them happy. And so at some point in the conversation, they both said, well, we know that God just wants us to be happy. And that became the justification that they used and the foundational motivation for their divorce. And so as we kind of get into our Unlearned series, looking at things Christians say and believe that are not biblical, this one is very challenging because you kind of have to thread a needle. There is some truth to this because it's actually more of a corruption of a true thing than it is a blatant lie, which become essentially the most dangerous ideas and teachings or things that are mostly but not completely true. So, does God want you to be happy? Of course he does. How could he not? He calls himself Father. He is not just a good father, but the perfect father. What parent doesn't desire happiness for their children? What parent doesn't go to great lengths to try to provide happiness for their children? Yes, God wants you to be happy. He desires for you to be happy. In fact, he desires it so much, he hardwired happiness into you. There are 3 chemicals that God put in our bodies that are released at different points that make us happy. Oxytocin, which is released during physical contact, and it's a bonding thing that creates relationships, makes us happy as we connect to other people. Serotonin, which is released with a sense of accomplishment. It's a value in a pursuit. And dopamine, when you achieve something, you get some things done, when you go on an adventure. This is why when you get a rush on a roller coaster, that's dopamine. And we have chemicals in our body that are released over and over again with certain experiences that make us feel happy because God designed you for happiness. He desires for you to be happy. Now, the difference here is how we pursue happiness. See, a child of God finds happiness in a different way than someone who lives and who is of the world. And what we have to understand is that happiness, though God desires happiness, the idea that God just wants us to be happy, and the trick here I think is the word just, that God just wants us to be happy elevates happiness above all things. And so when we believe that God just wants us to be happy, or ultimately that God's will is for us to be happy, it gives us an excuse, right, to do whatever we want in pursuit of happiness. And so in the name of happiness, we will do all kinds of ungodly things. We will disobey God's instructions blatantly because we believe that these things will make us happy. And then we justify it, saying, well, God wants me to be happy, so he can't be mad that I did this. That's not how it works. God does not desire you to be happy at all costs. He's not saying, I want you to be happy, even if that means sinning against me. No, happiness, pursuing happiness, does not justify sin. And that's the problem. We elevate happiness above God. Happiness is not God. Happiness is a byproduct of something that's found in God. We find happiness in God. We pursue happiness in God. We receive happiness in our relationship with God as a child of God. But happiness itself is not God. And so the idea is we have to take out that thing that makes happiness the exclusive focal point of our purpose and pursuit. See, Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So what you treasure, you love. When we treasure God, when we love God and pursue God, we will find happiness in God and in the things of God. When we value and pursue and love the things of this world, we try to find happiness in the things of this world. Well, what Psalm 37:4 says, delight yourself in the Lord. And so God's desire is for you to be happy. But his desire is for you as his child to find your happiness in him. to delight in him, to rejoice in him, to understand the significance of his grace and his love and the life that he gives. God desires for you to obey him, to trust him, to pursue him, to live for him, and in your pursuit of him, to find your delight and your happiness in him. God created you. He created a hole in your heart and in my heart that only he can fill, because God desires for us to find our happiness, to find our completeness, to find our joy in our pursuit of him. Sin is when we treasure something that is not God. All sin comes from our pursuit of happiness, right? It's this thing's going to make me happy, so I'm going to sleep with this person I'm not married to. I'm going to do this thing that I should not do. I'm going to ignore God. I'm not going to go to invest myself in what God's telling me to do because that doesn't seem fun or that's uncomfortable. No, when we pursue or things outside of God in effort to make ourselves happy, we're worshiping the creation ahead of the Creator. And we're valuing, loving, treasuring creation above Creator. Happiness is not the goal. Happiness is the byproduct of our pursuit of God. When we pursue God, we find this great joy, great delight in him, regardless of what's going on in our life. The way Paul describes it, like Paul goes through suffering. Yeah, but he gets stoned, he gets shipwrecked, he gets beaten, imprisoned, he's in danger everywhere he goes, and he's actually kind of bragging about that. Like, that's not pleasant things. They're not things that he enjoyed because he was a sadist. But those things happened to him because of his pursuit of God, because of his love for God. And in that, Paul rejoiced and Paul delighted, because happiness is the natural byproduct of the pursuit of Jesus. The challenge, the problem with thinking of happiness as something that's just what God wants for me, is that when we elevate happiness above obedience, when we elevate happiness above God, love for God, it's not that you take happiness out, or it's when we make the one above the others, we will disobey that obedience, will disobey God because we think this thing will make us happy. Who's going to chase after suffering if they think that God's ultimate will for their life is to be happy? You're going to avoid anything that you don't want to do. You're going to avoid being uncomfortable. You're going to avoid anything that challenges you. You're going to avoid suffering and pain. But sometimes that suffering and pain is a tool that God uses to bring you a greater joy, to bring us a greater hope. As it says in the Bible, our afflictions and struggles in this life are momentary and light in comparison to the reward that God has for us in eternity. It's almost as if the struggles that we endure now build an even greater reward in our eternity, so we should delight in them. But when you're looking to be happy, you're not going to take any path or any road that might lead to suffering. But for a lot of times in the Christian faith and in our pursuit of obedience to God, out of our love for God, there's some challenges and suffering along the way. There are hardships and pain in this life. And if we're not willing to go down that because we've elevated happiness above God, then our pursuit of happiness causes us to walk away from God rather than to chase after God. And so yes, God desires for you to be happy, but he desires you to find that happiness in your pursuit of him. Not in avoiding suffering, but in being obedient. Like that's with Jesus going to the cross. Like Jesus delighted in God. Jesus rejoiced in God, found his joy in God. But that also led him to a cross. And he was willing to endure the cross and to endure it because it was God's will. He didn't desire that, but he endured that because of his desire to please and to follow God's instructions, as we should. In our pursuit of God, in our obedience to God, we find the greatest joy. Because the greatest joy in this life is found in Jesus. Because any other thing that gives us happiness will fail. Any other thing will fall short. Everything in this world is imperfect, and so the happiness that it brings is not going to last. It's not going to be perfect. So the highest perfection, the greatest joy, the greatest happiness, the greatest hope that we can have will always be found in Jesus. And so when we fulfill and satisfy our happiness in him, it will always be more significant, greater, and it will last forever. And so the greatest pursuit of happiness is happiness that we pursue in God, in our relationship with Jesus. And that's what God desires for us. God does desire for you to be happy, but God does not just desire for you to be happy. He desires for you to trust and to follow him, to obey and honor him. He desires for you to be his child and to follow Jesus. And following Jesus leads to happiness. Following happiness does not lead to Jesus. So I hope that kind of clarifies. That's a very challenging, again, very tricky question, because happiness is not a bad thing. Happiness is not an evil thing, but the pursuit of happiness has led to pretty much every bad or evil thing that's ever happened in the history of the world. And so, as with a lot of things, it's all about how we apply it and how we pursue it. Happiness is a good thing. Happiness is a God thing, so long as we pursue it in a godly way and not elevating it above God as an idol to be worshipped in all things. His ultimate goal, God's ultimate goal for you, is not happiness in every single moment. It's that you would find your joy in Him.